Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Warner. I'm the Executive Director of Penn's Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics. Welcome to today's seminar, Climate Change, Disruption, and Health Equity. Today's seminar is co-sponsored by the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy here at Penn and is also part of Penn's Energy Week. We have a great group of panelists today joining us. Sue Ann Bell is an assistant professor in the Department of Systems, Populations, and Leadership at the University of Michigan. She serves as a clinician for the National Disaster Medical System and as a health scientist on the National Advisory Council to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Elizabeth Fussell is a professor of population studies and environment and society at Brown University and the editor-in-chief of Population and Environment. Michael Mann is a presidential distinguished professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania and is the director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. He's also co-founder of realclimate.org. And Jacoby Wilson is a professor at the Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the director of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health at the University of Maryland. Today's seminar will be moderated by Courtney Bowen. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology here at Penn, and she is a senior fellow at LDI. Welcome, everyone. Courtney, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for everyone being here. The World Health Organization has identified climate change as the biggest global threat to health of the 21st century. Heat waves, droughts, storms, and sea level rise present direct threats to our health. Diseases, food and water insecurity, undernutrition, and forced displacements are some of the indirect impacts that follow some of these catastrophes. During a disaster, healthcare infrastructure is also affected, which compromises health in surrounding areas. And so all of this adds up to massive effects on health. However, the extent to which a person might experience the many health threats of the climate emergency is shaped by structural inequalities, including racism and economic exploitation. While those with wealth and political power are most likely to see some of the economic benefits that result from polluting activities and be best able to prepare for and recover from extreme climate events, poor and racially minoritized groups bear the brunt of the resulting disinvestment and risk. Globally, many of the groups and places that are most threatened by the multiple risks associated with the changing climate are among the least responsible for some of the factors and processes driving it, like greenhouse gas emissions. Together, this highlights the need for us to think about climate change and social inequality, as well as population health inequities, as mutually reinforcing processes that must be addressed simultaneously. In today's webinar, we're going to touch on climate science, talk about climate disruption and migration, the relationship between environmental, climate, and social justice, and also talk about how climate change exacerbates existing structural inequalities as it shapes health and healthcare. We've invited 4 amazing experts to address these topics and explore ways to better prevent, prepare for, and mitigate the impact of a changing climate on health and healthcare inequalities. So with that, I want to just jump right in. My first question today is for Michael. We hear a lot about climate change. It's all over the news. For those of us on social media, it's there too. And as an expert on the topic, I wonder if you could just start our conversation today by grounding it and giving our audience an overview of the changing climate's impacts on health. Why is this dimension of the climate crisis so important and receiving so much attention now? And then also thinking about what are the future implications of the climate emergency for health?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. It's great to be with you all here today. This is the defining challenge and the defining crisis of our time. The climate crisis exacerbates all of these other challenges that we face, and nowhere is that more evident than with human health, the impacts of climate change on human health. And some of those impacts are perhaps pretty obvious. On a hotter planet, you're going to have more frequent and intense heat waves, and heat is the -- 1 killer when it comes to environmental conditions, when it comes to weather conditions. So first of all, we're going to see increased heat stress. There is, as Courtney alluded to, there is a sort of social justice and inequality component to this as well, because urban heat islands tend to be hotter, of course, than the outlying areas. And many of the underserved and sort of frontline poor communities are often located in those areas where there's greater heat stress, where you get more of that sort of deadly summer heat. And we're starting to see levels of heat, especially in these urban heat islands that are essentially, dangerous, that are dangerous enough that human beings can't literally spend much time outside without succumbing to heat stress. So we're seeing that. We're seeing, of course, increased flooding. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. So when it does rain, you get more intense rainfall events. And we saw that here in Philadelphia with Hurricane Ida that dumped out record amounts of rainfall over a relatively short period of time. There was massive flooding. And once again, in particular, in some of those low-lying areas that tend to be, where frontline communities are located. And so we once again see the inequality in how climate change is increasing these adverse health conditions. Eastwick, Philadelphia, is really almost a laboratory for how that is all coming together, how climate change induced flooding is really impacting, again, underserved communities, minority communities, and frontline communities. So that's something of great interest to us here at Penn, of course. I am, of course, a climate scientist by training, but something that I'm quite concerned about is the impacts of climate change on human health. It's something that we're doing quite a bit of work here in our center, the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, the Annenberg Public Policy Center. This is something that we're talking about quite a bit because it's really where the rubber, hits the road, rubber meets the road, is when you see how climate change is leading to adverse health effects and is particularly impacting, as Courtney said, those least responsible for creating the problem. It's the global north, it's wealthy industrial societies, and in particular, higher income people who have generated most of the carbon pollution. Those least sort of responsible for it are bearing the brunt of the impacts. I would also remark on one other aspect of the problem. When it comes to climate change, of course, it's caused by human-generated carbon pollution, the burning of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, oil. But the extraction and burning of fossil fuels also leads to massive air and water pollution. And once again, those who are most likely, for example, to live near refineries, to live near brownfields and polluted areas are going to be those lower income people. So once again, we come back to this fundamental inequity when it comes to the impacts of climate change on human health. And finally, when you look at the combined impact of pollution from fossil fuel burning and the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events, on flooding, on extreme heat, climate change is, by that measure, a deadlier crisis than even the COVID-19 crisis that we've been dealing with for the past several years. By any measure, far more human lives will be lost due to the combined impacts of climate change and pollution from fossil fuel extraction and burning than have died due to the COVID crisis. So soon enough, hopefully, COVID-19 will be in our rearview mirror, but we will still face an even greater crisis. And that's not going away anytime soon. And it demands our attention, and it demands that we do everything we can to mitigate, to prevent a worsening of the problem, continued warming of the planet, and to provide the resources to help those, who have the least infrastructure and capability of dealing with the devastating impacts that we're already seeing.
Great, thanks so much for that. I want to turn next to Beth, whose work has focused largely on climate-related migration in recent years. Hurricane Katrina has been cited as causing the largest US movement of people forced to migrate because of a climate event since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. So Beth, I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about what are the consequences of this type of climate-triggered migration? We can think about some migration may be sudden in the midst of a disaster, while others forms of migration are going to be slower from climate-related threats or stress. As we think about climate-related migration, what does it mean for populations and communities experiencing it?
Thanks, Courtney, and everybody, all the organizers, for bringing us here together to have this conversation. I've been studying Hurricane Katrina since it happened, and when I was an assistant professor at Tulane University and living in New Orleans. And I want to point out that Hurricane Katrina sort of fulfilled the expectations that people have when they think about climate impacts on population. It was sort of that disaster movie scenario where the overwhelming forces of this hurricane event forced so many people to leave their homes. And so it really galvanized attention around climate-related migration. However, I think it's really an exceptional example as more research is accumulated about climate and migration. We're increasingly honing in on the idea that the effects of climate change on human mobility are heterogeneous. Sometimes they set people in motion, and at other times, these various events may trap people in place. And so the key thing to understand why the effects of climate change are heterogeneous when it comes to migration is that it's not the natural hazard itself that creates a disaster. Often in popular media, we say that it's a hurricane disaster, but really the disaster occurs when society isn't able to cope with the hazard. If a hurricane comes through any town and the town is resilient, the built environment can sustain the force, no disaster happens, but you still experience the hazard. And so it's important to realize that the disaster really is in the failure of society to cope with the natural hazard. So we have to look at what's on the ground, what's failing during a hazard exposure that makes some people vulnerable to harm, whether that's harm to their health or to their damage to their property and the community in which they live. And so that's really what we have to think about as when we think about why migration may or may not occur in the event of a natural hazard event. So when getting back to Hurricane Katrina, what we saw on the ground was the levee failure. The levee that had been built around this below sea level city failed and water filled in the bowl. New Orleans is really unique in that the built environment in which it exists, that it is very vulnerable to water, but for so long, the levees have held and they've been protected, or they've been sustained by federal investments in the Army Corps of Engineers. But we all knew that when the levee failed, the disaster in New Orleans would be tremendous. And I think every community needs to look at what's on the ground, how is it resilient or not to the effect of very different climate hazards that may be increasing in frequency, intensity, destructive power in the future. So getting back to Michael's point, heat really is the greatest direct threat to human health, and one that we all need to prepare for. The other climate hazards are going to be sort of geographically specific, but everybody in those at the local level needs to understand the hazardscape of their community and how they are or are not prepared to deal with that hazard, as well as reflecting on who in their community is really most vulnerable. Those are the kinds of questions that we need to think about in order to think about who's most likely to either be trapped in place or to be forced to leave in the event of a climate event.
Thanks for that. I want to return back to something that I think Michael brought up, but so Kobe, I think you're really well positioned to sort of talk with us a bit more about, the communities that have to contend most with the impacts of climate change are also most likely to experience exposure to toxic chemicals and poor water quality, poor air quality. Could you talk to us a bit about why that is the case? How are environmental justice and climate justice related? And in particular, how has structural racism directly contributed to climate and environmental injustice in the United States in particular?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, just following what Michael said. So when we think about environmental injustice, is really we think about defining it as how some communities due to their race, ethnicity, their class, geography, maybe language, are differentially burdened by environmental hazards and what we call locally wanted land uses. And so Michael mentioned a few of those. You could have petrochemical operations, refineries. So those of you may be familiar with Cancer Alley, the 80-mile corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It's been called that, but you have communities that have some of the highest cancer risks in the country. You can go to other parts of the country where they may be having issues with landfills, or for example, in Baltimore, we have a community called Curtis Bay, which is sort of a quintessential EJ community, which is industrialized. It's been impacted by the Port of Baltimore as multiple large polluters. There was a study came up a few years ago called super polluters. So coal-fired power plants has the largest medical waste incinerator in the country, also has a trash incinerator, also has a lot of diesel truck traffic, Superfund sites, brownfields. Those are types of things that you see in communities that are impacted by environmental injustice. And usually when you think about those populations that live in those communities, there's some type of external reason, right? They have underlying social, economic vulnerabilities that drive differential burden, drive differential exposure, drive differential risk, and drive differential health outcomes. In many cases, structural or structured racism is the reason why you see a lot of communities of color who are experiencing those differential, burdens, exposure, and risk. Think about historic patterning of housing opportunity around, segregation and redlining, right? Look at how some communities are able to get, loans and not get loans. For some reason, look at Mossville, Louisiana. Parts of the country where folks don't have access to publicly regulated sewer and water infrastructure. I like to say they're pre-New Deal communities. Lowndes County, Alabama, Uniontown, Alabama, colonials along the Mexico-Texas border, right? Agricultural workers, folks in Appalachia are indigenous brothers and sisters. For some reason, they don't have access to publicly regulated sewer and water infrastructure. That is a big environmental justice issue that's driven by this structural or this structured racism. So those same communities are differently impacted by lack of access, overburden. You could have lack of access to health promoting infrastructure. So you can see the intersection of that in Jackson, Mississippi. I'm from Mississippi, right? I have family who live in Jackson. So this investment and divestment in Jackson is 80% Black, right? So you have the lack of access to good water infrastructure, but you have also other hazards that get concentrated in these communities of color, and they end up becoming sacrifice zones, right? You can we know about Flint, Michigan. You know about what's happening in Baltimore. You can go across the country, communities that have highways and byways that dissect them and bisect them, done on purpose through the National Highway Defense Act. Those are also, when we think about greenhouse gas emissions and the co-pollutants, right? Build highways for these communities on purpose. So the urban heat islands are not by accident. It's through planning, the impervious surfaces, the albedo effect, right? And the fact you have greenhouse gases, as Michael and others mentioned, greenhouse gases, the co-pollutants like particulate matter, and you have a physical stressor like heat, right? So those are differentially burdened by hazards and toxic exposures are also the ones that have more differential risk from climate change. So you may not believe in climate change, but believes in you if you're poor, if you're Black, if you're Hispanic, if you're indigenous, right? If you don't have access to healthcare, you don't have health insurance, you live in the floodplain, and so, or you have underlying comorbid conditions. So you have to look at the intersectionality, right, of susceptibility factors, what's an intrinsic. So age, you're a child, pregnant woman, if you're older, susceptibility factors, a family history of certain health conditions. And then the vulnerability factors are extrinsic. So as was just stated, your hazard scape, understanding that, your access to nature, the natural buffers, not having wetlands. So you have communities who are overburdened and do not have access to the infrastructure that allows them to be resilient to these climate-related perturbations, which can lead to issues of climate redlining, where some, the haves and have not, the haves have more resilient infrastructure and the have-nots have less resilient infrastructure because of investments, which lead to exacerbation of underlying risk. And then when you have an event, the have-nots are not going to be able to bounce back in the same way that the haves will.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Sakabi just said. There's actually some really interesting, detailed climate science that backs this up. I don't know, Sakabi, if you know Marshall Shepard, is a friend and colleague of mine at the University of Georgia, who's actually done some meteorological modeling. He's a climate scientist and an atmospheric scientist, and they've actually done sort of micro scale meteorological modeling of the detailed sort of evolution of weather systems as they come through the Atlanta, Georgia metro region. And you can actually show that the areas that get the heaviest precipitation at that sort of micro scale, at the scale of blocks and subregions of the city, invariably the areas that get the heaviest flooding rainfall are those low income areas, typically minority populations, underserved communities. So there is this underlying pressure that literally pushes these folks into the most vulnerable locations when it comes to flooding risk. And of course, as Sakabi already mentioned, that's clearly the case with urban heat islands and heat stress as well.
Thank you both for that. I mean, this is going to be an issue that we are going to continue to come back to in today's conversation, given that it underlies all of the problems that we're going to be talking about as related to climate. Sakabi mentioned, healthcare infrastructure as one sort of critical piece of infrastructure that is especially important when we think about which communities are going to be able to sort of respond and be protected from the harms of climate-related events. And so I wanted to turn next to Sue-Ann to get us thinking about the healthcare infrastructure as it relates to the climate emergency. The National Academy of Medicine report on disaster resilient communities calls for identifying gaps in both patient and healthcare system disaster response. Could you talk to us a bit about what is a disaster resilient system? Are there ways that we can build and improve these systems to ensure both their long-term sustainability, both in terms of financial sustainability as well as environmental sustainability?
Thanks, and thank you for having me. So in 2022 alone, there were 18 separate weather and climate-related disasters where costs were more than $1 billion per disaster, and total costs were estimated at around $170 billion. So just from a financial standpoint, the impetus to create disaster resilient systems is certainly more than upon us. So when we're thinking about resilient systems, we really should be thinking about them as on a continuum. So what are the steps we can take today? What can we plan for tomorrow? How we can move the needle forward every day? Resilience has utility from a theoretical sense, but also from a practical sense in terms of guiding operations like planning and management. And thinking with a mindset of resilience as a continuous process can better help us to anticipate for some of these major disaster events. And a big part of resilience in terms of disasters and disaster management is how we mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. And resilience metrics can guide our progress and show us what the gaps are in those areas. And there's really any number of metrics in use and under development right now around resilience and resilient healthcare. And many of these represent different and separate domains of resilience. like staffing or organizational capacity, critical infrastructure, different types of hazards a system might face. And I think an important consideration is that we don't have metrics that encompass the total picture of what a resilient system is. And I think that's okay. But one advancement I'd really love to see is the development of an integrated data platform that also includes harmonization across these metrics. So I think the next question was about improving systems and long-term sustainability. And when we're thinking about climate-driven extreme weather events, we have to shift our current reactive stance to one that's proactive. We really have to get ahead of it. And for so many communities and response organizations, that means working on mitigation and preparedness while still being in a response or recovery mode. And so many places and people are too under-resourced to make this happen. And I know we might talk about the Inflation Reduction Act later in this panel, but this is one specific avenue that can help communities have the resources to better address some of their most urgent needs, and human resources to actually do the work is one of those. So next, I think in terms of improving these systems, one thing we have to think about is the whole of the community, where healthcare is one part of a larger system. So healthcare organizations need to think about linking as a system with emergency management, disaster response organizations, and also those that ensure critical infrastructure like water, transportation, electricity, even supply chain. And these are only a few in that larger whole community system. And as part of this, we need to be ready to address structural health needs across the community, like healthcare systems ensuring access to healthcare services before, during, and after disasters. And that gets us back to that continuum of resilience I talked about earlier, thinking about what the continuum of community needs is, ranging from short-term early recovery needs to decisions about long-term healthy community goals. And then, similar to what Sokobi said, we need to recognize and address what policy and planning processes are in place now that generate or perpetuate existing vulnerabilities. And then finally, in terms of finances, we really need to make greater advancement in thinking about quantifying cost savings for healthcare institutions specifically to address disaster resilience. There's a statistic that gets tossed around a lot from the National Institute of Building Sciences that for every $1 invested into disaster mitigation, it saves society $6. So what if we started thinking more about the benefits of disaster resilience investments in the healthcare sector and what those savings might look like, not only in terms of financial savings, but also in quality of life for individuals and communities as well.
Great, thanks so much for that. I mean, I want to highlight two things that I think are so important that you just said. One is this shift from thinking about a reactive response to a proactive planning response, which I think is critical. And the second being thinking about the healthcare system as networked in an infrastructure of care that extends beyond hospitals and medical care centers to thinking about the social safety net and community infrastructure more broadly. So thanks for that. You mentioned, Sue-Ann, the Inflation Reduction Act. And I wanted to sort of pose a question to the entire group. And so whoever sort of wants to jump in here, please do. The Biden administration has issued an executive order on climate change. As Sue-Ann mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act also has provisions addressing the issue. What do you all see as some of the potential opportunities of these federal monies? How do you think these new funds should be best spent to address, in particular, the disparate impact that climate change will have on especially structurally vulnerable communities? And thinking also about, what are the potential limitations of these funding mechanisms? And so I urge, any one of you who has thoughts on any one of these dimensions of this question to jump in.
Michael, you can go ahead. I'll go after you if you want to. Go ahead.
I can talk sort of in some generality about what I think is most important about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm sure some of the others can weigh in on some of these more detailed questions. It was a monumental piece of legislation. It's the boldest climate bill that it's really the only climate bill we've ever really seen pass Congress. The climate provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, the commitment to providing subsidies and incentives for renewable energy. There could have been more disincentives for fossil fuel energy, but to get one might have liked to have seen a little bit more stick as well as the carrot in this bill. And what happened was to pass it with just 50 Democrats, including a coal state Democrat. Unfortunately, some of the stick part of the bill got removed. I mean, we need to be putting our thumb firmly on the right side of the scale, and that involves both incentives for renewable energy and disincentives for fossil fuel energy, getting rid of subsidies for fossil fuel industry and cheap leases, cheap drilling leases, all that sort of stuff. There could have been more of that in the bill, but when policy experts crank through the numbers, what we find is that the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, if they are implemented, and that's critical because we can be sure that polluters and politicians who do their bidding are going to try to block the implementation of many parts of this bill. But if those climate provisions are implemented, it should reduce carbon emissions in the US by about 40% by 2030. Now, we have to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 globally if we are to keep warming below 3 degrees Fahrenheit, a level of warming where we will see far worse human health consequences. So that's really the target that most of us are looking at. We need to keep that warming below 1.5 Celsius. That's 3 degrees Fahrenheit. This doesn't go far enough to do that. And of course, the industrial world has to do more than the global average because we have a much greater legacy when it comes to the carbon pollution up to this point in time. And so we've got to do better than that, but it's a good first first gambit, and it needs to be improved upon for certain if we are to avert catastrophic warming. That's just the mitigation side of it. Then there's the adaptation side, all of the things in that bill, and also the infrastructure package, which also contained provisions to provide assistance to frontline communities that are dealing with the effects of pollution, historical effects of polluted environment, that are dealing with the worst consequences of climate change. That's equally important. And so I'll pass the baton off to Sakabi and others maybe to talk more about that.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. So, as an environmental justice, advocate, you look at Executive Order 14008. That's one of the main climate change executive orders. As we move from a dirty energy economy to a clean energy economy, 40% of the benefits should go to disadvantaged communities. So that's the Justice 40 initiative. I would say that both the bipartisan infrastructure law, the money's in there for EVs, the money in there for electrification. I mean, there's some pros and cons to electrification, of course. The money's in Inflation Reduction Act on the consumption side and on the production side are important. And I would say that most environmental justice issues, historically, when you look at legacy pollution, are actually energy injustice issues, as from extraction to transport to processing to combustion, right? So there's opportunities to really, if you're, I like to say the frontline communities, those are that are frontline should be the front of the line as it comes to the dollars that are out there. Those are taxpayers' dollars. So making sure that we have systems in place that they get these dollars. My concern and others' concern in the movement is we haven't had great systems in place to allocate dollars from the, at the federal level. Look at FEMA, for example, and how when you think about recovery dollars, right? Look what happened with Katrina and what's happened in other disaster, events. And also the system to receive the dollars. Many of the states where the rubber meets the road are part of the problem. The reason why you have environmental justice in the first place. They're giving away taxpayers' money. They're giving away subsidies, tax breaks to these big companies to actually pollute these communities. They're creating these conditions that lead to environmental justice that also leads to differential climate risk, right? So you guys, systems of allocations are problematic. Systems received, they're problematic. And in the communities that they're most in need, they don't have the system in place to really apply for the dollars, to get the dollars, to use the dollars, et cetera. And the companies will be doing the work, right, to build the new infrastructure. They don't look like the communities, okay? So you have a DEI issue. And some of these companies don't have a good track record when it comes to diversity, their C-suite, their working population. My dad was a pipe fitter, okay? last hired and first fired. So you talking about a just energy transition, right? How you have a just energy transition when the folks who need the jobs the most, you have these issues. There's a lot of issues in the implementation and getting these dollars to communities. But I want to be positive. I want to be just, problematized. I want to be positive. I think there's a lot of work that's happening with Justice for the Accelerators. There are a lot of foundations that are doing really interesting work to kind of provide support for it. We just got a funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to start a Mid-Atlantic Climate Action Hub, where we're engaging communities in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, Prince George's County, Virginia, DC, who are doing EJ work that also do climate justice work and help them provide technical assistance to write grant proposals so they can get the dollars. Kresge Foundation has its Climate Equity Health Board, where they're doing work to see best practices and case studies on addressing getting equity in climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience right. So there's others. National Academy of Sciences is doing some work as well. So I think this opportunity, if we can build the infrastructure to make sure as the dollars come down, the right communities are getting the dollars. So you have to be able to identify, prioritize, and micro-target the communities that have been sacrifice zones, communities that are the hot spots, communities that are dealing with differential climate risk. I know I'm talking too much. I'm going to pass the mic to someone else, but I'll stop there.
I just want to add on to this discussion with a real concrete example about how there's structural inequality built into the Inflation Reduction Act. So, for example, electrification, we all could, as we make decisions about how we cool or heat our homes, that's really important to move to electricity-driven appliances. And there's money in that Inflation Reduction Act for mini splits, for heat pumps that can both cool and heat your home as a greener and more sustainable way of heating homes. But to take advantage of those incentives, you have to own your home. You have to have the money up front to actually buy those heat pumps. And so there's a built into the transition, the people who are most able to take advantage of these incentives, hopefully will do it first. But a lot of the population that rents their homes tend to be lower income, more likely to be racialized members of racialized groups, and other people who have fewer resources to make that upfront investment. And there's no plan for how those people can access more efficient, sustainable cooling and heating systems. That's something that we have to put on our radar screen. How do we help those people? And really, it would mean giving incentives to their landlords to make those investments in their housing. And so that's sort of the problem that we have to overcome to figure out how to serve that population. And of course, we've been talking about how heat is going to be one of the most lethal hazards, climate hazards. And so this directly addresses that risk by putting more efficient cooling into people's homes.
Thanks. I just have one more thing to add. And so much of my work focuses on older adults and healthcare and long-term care settings. So I'm closely following a recent U.S. Senate Committee on Finance report around power outages in nursing homes. And one of their key recommendations in this report was around incorporating renewable energy into emergency preparedness planning, not just for nursing homes, but for healthcare entities. And the report also highlighted the funding available through the Inflation Reduction Act that can help reduce some of the costs of this clean energy installation in healthcare systems.
Can I just add real quickly? And when you think about, again, to be positive, I think this money is, as Michael says, seed money. It's money on the problem side is going to go away. But how can we have public-private partnerships that do matching, right? How can we make sure that we're doing more, creating these hubs, as I mentioned, and there's even hubs of partners, so we can do like one-stop shop, wraparound services for the communities that we know are most at risk, right? I think that's a model And so as we work with healthcare infrastructure and other infrastructures, I think someone said before, I think Sue maybe said before, a systems approach. I think that's important to make sure within the systems, we're bringing these dollars together and doing matching, layering and stacking of investments in communities. And it's not just money, but it's also resource leveraging. So I think that's important. And then also, for example, Baltimore has its climate resilience hubs. So how can we extend those? And then making sure at the local level, you may have a county level climate action plan, but we need to make sure every neighborhood, particularly those that are most at risk, have their own climate action plans, right? So just want to share that and making sure that we're getting to those who are most vulnerable and most susceptible when it comes to climate change.
That's great. I mean, I think all of you raised an important point that someone else put in the Q&A part of this webinar, which is that how can we ensure that alongside investments, we're also developing the institutional processes that ensure that those folks rendered most vulnerable are able to access these types of investments and funds. I want to turn to sort of shift gears a little bit. Before this call, many of us were talking about the sort of small nature of the research community, talking and thinking about these issues. I was thinking about my own field of sociology, which is sort of centered on inequality and how climate related research has really taken up such a small space among in the field of sociology. Someone asked in the chat, given the growing frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters and their subsequent impacts on health and health inequities, what are the gaps in the science that currently exist? Dr. Bell sort of touched on some of these issues, but I think this question sort of centrally gets at what are the current research priorities for engaging in policy relevant and practice relevant research on the links between the climate emergency and health.
So I'm happy to talk about the sort of the climate science, and others can speak to how that connects with the social science here. One of the uncertainties in climate models today has to do with extreme weather events, and so much of the damage and so much of the danger posed to human health is associated with these extreme weather events. The critics love to claim that climate models exaggerate the problem, that our predictions have somehow failed. Actually, if you look at the predictions that were made decades ago, we've done a very good job predicting the warming that was expected given the ongoing addition of carbon pollution to the atmosphere. But where the models don't do very well, they actually underestimate some of these critical impacts. And so uncertainty isn't our friend. If anything, it's breaking against us when it comes to some of the more, again, the risk that is posed by climate change, some of the impacts that pose the most risk, again, particularly to human health. And so extreme weather events, these very persistent, droughts and heat waves and wildfires out west. We've seen, record flooding back east. Many of these very persistent weather extremes are associated with a change in the basic behavior of the jet stream, where the jet stream, you get these meanders in the jet stream, and those are associated with, extreme weather regimes. And those meanders tend to grow in amplitude under certain conditions. So you get deeper highs and you get deeper lows and you get more extreme weather. And the models are not actually capturing some of the physics that we know is relevant to how global warming is impacting the jet stream and increasing the likelihood of these very damaging weather extremes. So from a risk standpoint, if anything, the models are actually underestimating the likelihood for an increase in some of the most damaging weather extremes. And that's really important to understand from a risk standpoint. We need to take, even greater precaution. We need to take even more dramatic action because of the possibility that many of these impacts will actually be worse than our models predicted.
I want to follow up on Michael's point about risk, because the people ultimately have to understand risk and then take action. to protect themselves, to protect their health and their property against those risks. And one of the things that's been so challenging in the climate emergency is that risk communication has been muddied by misinformation, by climate misinformation, which has been almost stronger in the United States than risk communication that is truthful and honest and not just truthful, but accurate and scientifically based. And so one of the things that social scientists need to do, Courtney, you and I share our home discipline of sociology, but to address inequality, we also need to really understand how people receive and process information, what gets in their way of translating information into behavior change and adaptation. And so that is a challenge that I think sociologists need to take more seriously. At Brown, there is a social science climate network where they're exactly studying this problem of climate misinformation and really tracking down where that misinformation is coming from, how it's been funded, and how to confront it so that we can understand, how to regulate information and provide people with information that's accurate, that comes from trusted sources, and that people can really use to protect themselves.
Quick follow-up to Elizabeth's comments. Elizabeth, we need to talk. We should talk. This is something that we're very interested in here at the University of Pennsylvania, both within the Annenberg Public Policy Center, which many people don't realize it was the birthplace of factcheck.org. So much of the mission is, in fact, to deal with misinformation and even worse, disinformation, intentional misinformation. It's intended to mislead. And it's something that our center is very interested in, the communication battle, because the communication battle isn't, as Elizabeth alludes to, it isn't taking place in a vacuum. It's taking place in an adverse environment where we face this very stiff headwind of a concerted misinformation campaign. And so, it isn't enough to just publish the science and hope that if we get the science out there, that politicians will make policy based on good science, because there's a concerted effort to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that's really where the battle lines are drawn right now.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in real quick. Just participated in the EPA climate change and risk communication meeting this week. And so we talked a lot about risk communication. I'm not sure how much I can share, but we'll just say that, we talked about the need for scientists to do a better job with science communication, to do a better job with community engagement, engaging the communities where they are, knowing your audience. So it's message framing. We mentioned in the discussion was an article about this doom and gloom in the New York Times. And I said, for communities I work in, they've already dealing with doom and gloom. That's not helping. So you just can't talk about problems. When you do risk communication, risk management, you got to have risk mitigation. You're not doing your job. You're doing a poor job. You said everything's going to be over in 10 years. That, for the communities I work in, they've been dumped on living in sacrifice zones, been poisoned for decades. That's not helping the cause. That's not helping giving them tools. That's not helping change behavior. So how do we actually bring in more science where we're actually uplifting community science, right? So that's really important part. Citizen science, community science. I talked about how you connect on any issue, particularly climate change, connect the people with pocketbook every day and what's proximal. Food, faith, family, health, and jobs. How do you connect your science to those things that matter to people every day? And so we had a very good discussion about, how do you get people to change their awareness and their agency, but then how they activate their agency that leads to actual behavior change at the individual level. And then how you have to bring in hope. We got to bring in more hope into this work, because unfortunately, when it comes to the major overall messaging, the doom and gloom, the world's going to end, that's not really benefiting us as we move forward in trying to address climate change. And then we have to talk about the co-benefits, science that looks at the co-benefits of our implementation of the policies and strategies around mitigation and adaptation, and share those co-benefits. And then speaking to the disinformation, misinformation, I think there's some corporations out there that need to play a bigger role in that. I know Meta is part of that, and they're doing some work on their climate communications. So how we engage them too, to make sure they are providing safe spaces and doing some of that work to act as the pushback on that disinformation, misinformation. So I know I talk too much, so I'm gonna pass the mic to Sue. I think Sue wanted to chime in.
Sure. Just one last thing to this point. So our healthcare systems on a daily basis are operating from a point of crisis without a disaster going on. Just on a daily basis today, access to healthcare is an enormous issue, and the resilience of healthcare systems without a pandemic or without an ongoing disaster, are hugely at risk. So thinking about how we can better support our healthcare systems and change for the way we deliver healthcare in this country is, an important and maybe not often directly thought of as connected to climate change and health, but we have to have a strong healthcare system that is able to take care of our population in order to address the impacts of climate change. So I think when we were talking about, research strategies, some of those actionable short and long-term strategies are what we need to see the most in terms of research innovations.
Yeah, I just wanted to, that's a great point by Sue Ann there. I wanted to amplify a point that Sakabi just made, which is about optimism and doomism. And it's gratuitous of me to mention this because it was the topic of my latest book, which you can see behind me, the New Climate War, which is really about how the impacts of climate change have become so clear to the person on the street that denial doesn't cut it anymore. And so what polluters are doing now is turning to other tactics. They don't care about the path we take to inaction. They just care about the destination. They want us on the sidelines. And if that's, if they can accomplish that by denying climate change even exists, they're going to do that, but that's not working anymore. So they're turning to division and deflection and doomism and despair mongering, because if they can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, it potentially leads us down that same path of disengagement. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware that there are bad actors out there in the social media space. State actors, Russia have been implicated in this, Saudi Arabia, that are actually trying to create this sense of doomism among those who would be most likely to push forward, those who would otherwise be engaged in the fight. And so that's what's so pernicious, and it's worked. It has led, especially a lot of young folks, to the conclusion that it's too late to do anything about the problem. And that's a win for the fossil fuel industry. That's a win for the polluters, if we buy into that framing.
Thanks. I think this leaves us at a really great place to think about our concluding thoughts. And it's building on this idea in an effort to resist the fatalism and doomism. Given all of the challenges that we've talked about today, all of you are continuing to work in this space and push forward. And so I'm wondering if you can talk, we'll have just 1 minute each, so keep your remarks to maybe a sentence or two. But what gives you hope? Where and how are we making progress here? What shows promise in helping us to prevent or mitigate the impacts of climate change on health? So if you can each just take 1 minute to sort of respond to that final question.
Sure, I'm ready. So I've talked today a lot about communities and disaster affected communities. And we always say that disasters begin and end locally. And I think from a community standpoint, the trust relationships and local knowledge that already exist in communities are some of the greatest strengths that can bring about change.
I'll add to what Sue said. In our meeting, we talked about communities and building trust building, anchor institutions, really the contextual experts who are there in the community, and really building partnerships. So how can you again have partnerships? And looking at all the groups across the country, the Climate Justice Alliance, all the EJ groups, the climate justice groups that are out there, those are the groups that we need to be leading with, because they're doing leading edge work, because they're in the community every day. So elevating, supporting them is the way we move forward to address climate change.
I'm going to take this in a more personal direction, which is that the more time I spend in nature, the more I appreciate nature, the more I feel like I have to work for this. And I think that, and I just want to say that, you know, the world is still a really beautiful place to live in. And we can't just focus on the doom and gloom. We have to appreciate how beautiful the world is. So organizations that take people outdoors, particularly kids outdoors, and pass on that love of nature, I think will be really making an important investment in the mental health of that generation, as well as the future of the planet.
Great comments all around. I don't have that much to add, to what's already been said, but I would make 3 points. What gives me optimism? First of all, as a scientist, it's the science. The science of the last 10 to 15 years has sort of revised our understanding of the directness and the immediateness of our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And we now know, because of the way the climate system operates, when we incorporate the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere and all the components of the climate system, one of the conclusions that's been reached is that when carbon emissions stop, the temperature of the planet stabilizes very quickly within a few years. And I could go into great detail about all the complicated physics of why that's true, because it's somewhat, it is complicated. But the fact remains that because of that, we know that there's a finite budget. There's some amount of carbon that we know that's left to burn. And if we don't burn through that budget, we can keep global temperatures still below that dangerous 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So my tagline these days is that there is urgency, but there is agency. And the science tells us that. What else makes me optimistic? The youth climate movement, and just the climate movement writ large, and how it's recentered this issue where it always needed to be. On our ethical obligation. This isn't just about science and economics and cost benefit analysis and policy and politics. It's about ethics. It's about our ethical obligation not to leave behind a degraded planet for our children and grandchildren. And finally, bullet point 3, what gives me optimism? These sorts of conversations, the fact that there are so many wonderful people with diverse talents and training thinking about this, working on this, working towards change.
Yeah, and with that, I just want to echo what Michael just said and say how much I appreciated today's conversation and how much I appreciated everyone in the audience joining and engaging in the Q&A, which we didn't have nearly enough time to get to all of the questions. But thanks to all of you for being here today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Reiterate Courtney's thank you. It was really wonderful conversation. And I'm also grateful to all of you for weighing in and providing your expertise and spending time with us. So thanks to all the panelists. Thank you, Courtney, for the great moderating, and thanks to the audience for participating. This will be our last virtual seminar for the semester, but we have a great in-person event coming up on May 5th, which will be a day-long conference on the future of drug pricing, another topic that comes up frequently in Washington, D.C. And so we hope to see you then. Thanks, everyone.